All right, well, here we go. I am now very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Sara Calvosa Olson. Sara is a Karuk food writer and author living on Huiman Coast Miwok land. She is the author of Chími Nu'am, Native California Foodways for the Contemporary Kitchen, published by Heyday. Her work dwells at the intersection of storytelling, Indigenous food systems, security, sovereignty, reconnection, and recipe development with an interest in using both culinary sound and faithfully updated techniques to honor tradition. Culinarily, culturally sound and faithfully updated techniques honoring traditional plants and animals for cooking inspires a new look at the oldest foods in California. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Sara.
Oh, Yotwa, thank you for that introduction. And I appreciate everybody for being here today. I have a little bit of the flu, so please bear with me if I suddenly duck off screen to blow my nose or if I go off mic or something. Just bear with me. I'm currently battling the flu, but I'm winning. So don't worry. I got this. I'll win. But right now it's got me on the ropes a little. But Ayuki, that means hello in Karuk. And I like to introduce myself and to kind of talk about where I'm from and my family and who I am, and also to acknowledge that I live on Coast Miwok land. And as a Karuk person living on Coast Miwok land, here in kinship, we would acknowledge each other's places that we have worked on and cultivated since time immemorial into this abundant place that we live in. And I spend a lot of time outside in my home here, and I can tell that the land still loves and appreciates the people and wants to be with the people by how abundant it has been nurtured into being here by those original people. And I'm grateful to be in kinship with them on this land and with you all in this conversation right now. So thank you for your time and for being here. So I am from Northern California. I'm Karuk, which is a tribe that's located on the Klamath River, which maybe you've heard some things about the Klamath lately. We've had some really amazing progress made in opening up the Klamath River and removing the dams. We have fish now that are spawning in places on the Klamath River that they haven't been in 100 years, and I never thought that I would see this in my lifetime, and it's just a really exciting time right now for the land and for Indigenous people, and to be in community with Indigenous people and fighting our fights and centering an Indigenous way of being in California. And I know that a lot of people are coming from places that are affected by climate change and affected by fire, especially right now. And my heart goes out to you all, and I'm keeping you in my prayers. We all are. And as a person that comes from a tribe that uses fire as a cultural land management technique, I really do, you really do have my heart and my sympathy, and I really do feel for that. Um, it's really frustrating, and I hope that going forward we can really center more Indigenous land management techniques. But so the Cutter people are in that part of the Klamath River that where the dam removals are, just downstream from the dam removals now. And in that area, I grew up on the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation, where the Hoopa people are, and then to the coast, to the west of us, are the Yurok people. So this little area of sister tribes here, and my family specifically comes from the confluence of the Salmon River and the Klamath River. So in the Happy Camp area. So my family names are Aubrey and Sanderson and Albers and Sipatan and Saptan. And that's on my mother's side. And my father he's from Calabria, from southern Italy. And that's where his family hails from, Reggio, and his grandmother's side of the family from Capri. and they came over via Ellis Island, and my family names are Calvosa and Khalifa. So those are essentially the cultural connections that I have the strongest connection to in my family. And let's go ahead and do I skip the slide or do you skip the slide? How does that work? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So,
I got it. Yeah, just let me know whenever you're ready to move slides and I'll move it for you.
mhm, okay. So, well, okay, go back to the other one. I'm sorry. This is gonna be an interesting circus because of this cult thing. But okay, so um my parents met up in Humboldt County and in the 70s, and they had a very back to the land style of life where we lived very rurally. We didn't have any electricity or running water, and there was a lot of gardening and gathering and hunting and but we also balanced that with requiring commodity boxes and getting going down and picking up commodity distributions. So my parents would essentially combine these life ways, my mom's way of living and my dad's cultural way of using food as a celebration and for bringing family together, combined with, you know, the needing the for the food security of the commodity boxes and learning how to can and preserve and they lived in a very communal way where our neighbors we would trade with each other. We would get giant like mayonnaise jars full of milk and trade them and such. So it was this very homesteading rural way of living, and as I grew up and I had children of my own, I really wanted to connect them to what it means to be a colored person and teach them about gathering and also to expand on the things that my parents were doing when it came to combining our foodways. And fortunately, I was not in the same situation as far as food security, so I was really able to build and develop a compendium of recipes that use these foods and could do recipe testing, and it felt much more abundant than it did as a child. So that's where this cookbook came from, is this compendium of home recipes that my family that I grew up eating and then that I expanded and built on as my family grew as well. So, next slide. That's just about me. But so part of all of this is really an exercise in food security and food sovereignty. You may have heard of food sovereignty and have heard people talk about it, but it is a movement that contains a huge umbrella of workers in tribal communities doing all different things. Food sovereignty is more than just food reliance and food security, although that is a cornerstone of food sovereignty, but it's our right to determine our relationships to our foods and our foodways and the land. It's our right to decide how we would like to eat. So when I am cooking with acorn and utilizing it in a way that I want to utilize it in, the fact that I'm able to gather it and have access to it and then use it that way, that is me exercising my sovereignty as a colored person to eat our traditional foods and have a relationship with our traditional foods. And we want that for everybody because of the implications for food security and land management. We want the right to protect and access our traditional foods on our traditional lands and practice our agricultural systems as well in managing these natural resources. So that is what food sovereignty is in a nutshell. And in this umbrella of food sovereignty are people doing a lot of things. They're doing language reclamation, education, science. We have very robust science departments in many tribal organizations, and yeah, basketry. And I'm doing recipe development in my own little way. So that's the part that I do is the recipe development. But there, it can be a lot of different things. Next slide. These are some of the traditional foods in our area, and this is a picture of the Salmon River that is facing west toward the sea and the Klamath River and Ishipishi Falls. Some of our traditional foods, acorns and salmon and eels. elk, deer. We have a wide variety of proteins. And huckleberries, Indian potatoes are camas bulbs, Brodiaea. So very starchy. They're a lot like sunchokes, Jerusalem artichokes. Mushrooms, as you may be familiar with in California, and especially in Northern California, where I'm from, we have some of the best mushrooms in the world, really incredible variety, morels, chanterelles, the matsutake tan oak mushroom, which is highly sought after as well. So lots of mushrooms and poultry, quail, and then grains, wild oats and buckwheat, pine nuts. It's a cornucopia truly of traditional foods in this area, and that's just a small fraction of the foods that I work with and the foods that we gather. And there are people that are living in this river community that are still relying on these foods. They're subsistence gatherers, and though the number of subsistence gatherers is getting smaller and smaller, this food sovereignty movement is a part of revitalizing these foodways for food security reasons as well, because this is a very rural area, and oftentimes due to weather, the roads will wash out. So having a pantry that's full of acorns or full of preserved foods that are traditional foods and perfect foods like this that contain all of the nutritional needs that our elders and children need, then it has really great implications for the success of our people. So, okay, next slide. So and want to I always like to give a kind of a brief overview of of how we got to where we are, and then just to bring everybody up to speed so that when you are doing your own work and your own connection, that you are aware of all of the context that is surrounding the issues that Native people and tribal communities are facing still and have continued to face. So it's important to know the background and the history and the context for your own connection as well, and to make sure that you're doing it in a good way in community. So challenges to food security for my tribe in particular, we were contacted relatively late in I believe it was like 1850, 1849. And it was by gold miners that came up the Klamath River for mining. And they did a lot of blasting and changing of the landscape in order to blast these hillsides for gold and look for gold, which was the first disturbance for our fish and their spawning habits and their spawning habitats. So they were the first ones, were the miners, and they came up, and many of them were Norwegian. There were Norwegian soldiers who had come up from Humboldt Bay and into up the Klamath to be miners. And then after the miners came the homesteaders, and the homesteaders, they had conflict with Native people, and the National Guard would come in to try to remove the native people from this really fertile land. The Hoopa Valley, especially, is incredibly beautiful and fertile land, and so the homesteaders were trying to move in. They would try to move in, and the National Guard supported that. So my ancestors would have to take to the hills, but as you could see, there's a lot of food there. We could survive indefinitely in the hills. So after the homesteaders comes the resource extraction companies like logging and timber, and they did an enormous amount of damage to the stream beds, and clear cutting changed the landscape, especially when we would have flooding afterward, and the streams would be filled with silt, and it was devastating to our fish populations. So at the time, also, we were dealing with boarding school generations where our children were being scooped and taken to boarding schools and separated from the land and language, and basically trying to, defang the native solidarity and native connection to the land. And then we had issues with overfishing and overharvesting from the fishing industry, and there, which is right around the time I was born in the late 70s, where the coming to the tail end of the fish wars and having to take that all the way to the Supreme Court. But there was a time where we had our first fish kill, where I believe it was something like there was not enough water. There had been dams upstream that were having agriculture diversions for water plus overfishing, and the water was too warm. And in spite of uh, our people warning the fishermen, like, this isn't going to be a good thing, they continued to fish. And then the water just got too low, and they had the first fish kill, and I believe it was like 30,000 fish died all at once. And it was devastating for our people. And we have been mobilized to continue to fight for the water ever since. And we've made some progress there, as you know, with the dams and with fishing and the health and habitat of our river as a living being of all of its own, and having its own autonomy, and treating it as if it is a living being and a person, and caring for it that way. So with the fish wars, at the tail end of the fish wars is when I was born, and I was really into the undam the Klamath movement. But also at the time there was a lot of cannabis growth and cannabis industry moving in. That was the illicit cannabis industry that would grow on Forest Service land or in the woods, and oftentimes their runoff would get into the creeks and streams as well. Or it was also not done in a way that was in, relationship with the land. So that was damaging, as well as foraging, because of the abundance of mushrooms and things like that in our area. We attract a lot of foragers. And in the 90s, when I was in high school, there was a shortage of matsutake mushrooms in Japan, and they sent people to our area and that from Japan to pay cash for mushrooms, which brought in many, many foragers and people, and they made a lot of money. But there was irreparable damage done to the mycelium mats of these tan oak mushrooms, which are very special. They only grow in a few places in the world: Japan, Northern California, and Southern Oregon, and I think Finland. So they're very rare. They're wonderful. If you've ever had an opportunity to try a matsutake mushroom, they're very different and very interesting. But unfortunately, I mean, it was a staple food for us and our people and our elders, and the way that it was extracted from our forests was very detrimental and harmful, and continues to be that way. And it is very, very challenging to combat foraging in our area, because there's no relationship between foragers and native people usually. So that's been challenging. And on top of that, we're also dealing with forest fires, which, as I said before, we're a people of the fire, and it's very galling to have our forests burning down at this heat, at the level of heat that we're seeing. And it's very frustrating to not be able to tend the land in the way that we know that it's crying out for. And yeah, but we keep working toward our own sovereignty and management, and we're going to stay working toward that even in the present day landscape. We take our wins, but we're going to keep going. And you can see, it's a generational thing. My parents coming up behind, and then me, and now my own children, my own sons are adults now, and they're taking it up as well. So we stay generationally fighting for the earth. So next slide. So just to kind of keep you up to date here, like, just to recap where we're at in this removal of native people from the land, and the way that it has affected us presently. So they start with the displacement and criminalizing our foods. We weren't allowed to hunt or fish or gather without special permits, even though we had been doing it forever. And then native people were ticketed relentlessly. It's still criminalized in many places in California to be a Native person gathering a traditional food. And you will still get ticketed. It's still a misdemeanor. And uh, yeah, and it's still ongoing. It's getting better in some places, but it does depend on the relationship between the tribal communities and the people who are in charge in any of the systemic governing bodies. And in some places, it's very complicated. You can have many governing bodies over, a piece of land, and it seems like it has many different people governing it. So that's complex. But so we've been displaced, our foods are criminalized, then everybody's put onto reservations where we are fed back from the wheat that is grown on our land, fed back these ag surplus commodity distributions. And so Native people are in survival mode. And that's where you develop fry bread and Indian taco and these foods that are really emblematic of our oppression and our survival at the same time. So the survival foods, we still have them, which develops like, diet related diseases, but we're surviving and, we're carrying on for the next generation. So now as the next generation, you can have some more like, there's rising action in Native communities, but we're still combating like overpriced grocery stores and bulk food stores, expensive organic food stores, but an erasure and appropriation of our regenerative farming techniques and things like that because the regenerative farming science is traditionally is indigenous farming. And if you call it that, or if you are acknowledging or centering indigenous people in that way, then it does call into question, well, how did you get the land that you're working, and who did that land belong to originally? And it creates a lot of questions, I think. So instead, it feels like it has been repackaged into this regenerative farming kind of organic movement. And inherently and there's nothing wrong with it inherently, but it is perpetuating erasure and disconnection rather than kinship. So right now, here we are at the height of a food insecurity and generational disconnection where even though we have all of this technology and all these things that are meant to bring us closer together, we are more food insecure than we've ever been in rural communities. And at this point, like the food sovereignty movement, kids like me have gone off to college and grown up, and here we are, we're coming back to in solidarity with each other to grow a food sovereignty movement all over the place for all Indigenous communities. So that's where we're at right now, and that's the work that I'm doing, and that's where you come in as well. After all of this is happening, you can come in and decide, like, what it is that you have to offer to a food sovereignty and security movement as well. So, next slide. And these, now that I've done like all the school portion, I guess, but these are my sons back when they still, you could tell they're super excited about acorns. And they grew up doing this, and this is just a little bit of the process of acorns, and they're a very important staple food for us. And acorns were the first foods that they started gathering and learning about and eating. So even though they look grumpy, they have a really good connection with these little relatives. And right now, what they're doing, we have gathered the acorns and they're cracking them and cleaning them and putting them into a jar of water to leach. All acorns are edible and they just need to be leached of their tannins. Some of them have more tannins than others, but acorns are a perfect food. They have fats, carbohydrates, and protein and a complete amino acid profile. They're a great food, no matter what. You just have to leach the tannins from them. And you can see in that picture with the yellow leaching out of the jars, that is the tannins. And the tannin can be used to tan hides. It's tan oaks. were great for that. We would also leach our acorns in the creek because the tannins coming out would ensure that there wasn't a buildup of algae. They would keep the algae low and keep the water cold and perfect conditions for our fish, lots of oxygen for the fish to spawn in the creeks. So the tannins had a lot of different purposes too, but in this case, I just toss the tannins and continue refreshing the water until the acorn meal is no longer bitter and it tastes sweet. And it has a really fragrant, almost almond-like smell sometimes. And yeah, and you can also maybe see, hopefully, there's a separation of starches. The starches are up at the top, and it's a really thick white starch. And then underneath that is the acorn meal. Now, the white starch is used in Asian cuisine cooking, and not necessarily the meal. So if you go to find acorn flour in a grocery store, like a Korean grocery store or something, that's just the starch. Uh, just a heads up about that. And so once you've leached it of all its tannins and it's ready to go, you squeeze out all of the water and it creates this acorn milk, which I either freeze or drink or use immediately, and it's also very nutritious and delicious. So once you have the meal, then squeeze it through some cheesecloth and put the meal on the food dehydrator on those jelly roll pans and dehydrate the meal. And then I can either put it back in the blender and whiz it into a flour, a very fine flour, or I can keep it as a meal and make like acorn miso or something like that. So that you can, once it's dehydrated, it keeps forever. You can make what you'd like with it, but we've got a picture in the corner at the bottom there of acorn soup that's done in a traditional way, and it is cooked with hot rocks inside. Um, so that's a traditional way of eating acorn soup. Or I like to bake bread. I mean, I have a bajillion recipes for it, but you can do whatever you want with it, either traditional or whatever works for your family. Sometimes my mother would, have to spread our food out and we would all get just a little bit, but at least we were still eating and still getting that nutrition in our diets. So that's the process for leaching acorns. It is labor intensive, so doing it all at once or doing it in community with people, it makes the job a lot easier. And yeah, that's how we always learn to do it. But it's also fine to start on your own and just kind of test it out and see what you think. And the cool thing about acorns when you gather them is kind of what you see is what you get because the shell is so thin. And if you've cured them for a year, then they shrink a little bit out of their testa, the membrane, but it's still pretty much the same size as what you're getting. So, next slide. Here's some other foods that I have made throughout my book and that I have just a demonstration of how, I guess, how much I love our foods and how much I believe that they should be celebrated in vibrancy because I know that our foodways weren't just acorn soup. As much as I love acorn soup, it's a hard sell sometimes for teenagers. And I really wanted my kids to appreciate earthiness and bitterness and fishiness and all of those flavors that they wouldn't necessarily get in a Western diet. But I still have to compete with Takis and fruit snacks like every other mother. We have to meet people where they're at, and you should begin where you're at as well. And so maybe just starting by mixing in a little bit of acorn flour or making an acorn pancake, which was one of the first things we made, acorn pancakes, acorn muffins, acorn pie crust to make acorn hand pies, things like that. But I wanted it to be beautiful and vibrant, and I wanted them to see how much we celebrate these little relatives and our relationship with them and how they're nourishing and coloring our spirit in the best way as well. So that's why my food is always bright, but also because that's just what our foods look like. And we didn't have a lot of documentation about our traditional foods because foodways were considered women's work. And the anthropologists were more interested in the exciting, you know, ceremony times. And in ceremony, we fast and we just eat acorn soup or smoked salmon. So that's really what has remained in the anthropological record. But, we know that these were all of our traditional foods and that they were vibrant and beautiful and that even from house to house that people would have different recipes and do things differently and have different preferences and yeah, so really just pulling that whole vibrant like attitude about our foods back into our foods is important to me and to the way that I feed my kids. So these are just some of the foods. I like to put flowers in my pasta and put nettles in my tortillas. And I brine my salmon and blackberries from the end of summer. So they're nice and umami, sweet, but still kind of savory. So that's just an example of how I like to cook with these foods and just sort of there's an infinite palette to work with. So, next. So as you are going forward, I think in discovering your own like cultural connections to land and foodways, it's important um to go in a good way in kinship. And traditionally, if there was no such thing as colonization, like imagine that there was nobody that came over, there was no colonizing, but we all managed to meet organically, that we would have shared with each other in kinship. We would have showed Italy what tomatoes were. We would have showed what these potatoes could do in their different colors and forms. We would have done this in kinship with everybody anyway. That's our way, and we still do that. So in kinship and keeping that as you know as a tenet of your practice, if you are interested in gathering, I do think it's important to note the difference between gathering and foraging and how close we are together in our call. Like we're being called to the land or being called there to be out there. I think that they were not too far apart in the way that we feel about abundance and food. The difference, though, between gathering and foraging is that gathering really implies relationship, that we are not just going out once to gather in a place that isn't our home. So I wouldn't go from the Bay Area to somebody else's home on lands that I don't belong to or have cultural connection to or community connection to gather from their lands. Certainly not once a year. And if I did have connection up there, I would build that connection first. So our gathering practices are grounded in service and reciprocity. The reciprocity is it begins with us. It's us first. What's our first act of service and what it is, and sometimes just being out there and and observing year round and taking a very slow intentional approach to accessing these rhythms is what a gatherer does. They are slow, intentional, they are jumping in to the jump rope that's already swinging and figuring out where you can make it better, what can you do to be in service of this land and these foods, and being observational, very much of a naturalist style of approach to that. But also, then it becomes about tending and burning and activism and restoration and all of these things start to snowball once you are out there and you have developed this relationship. And when I'm out gathering, I'm gathering for my community. It is a priority to gather for community because we are called to support each other in community throughout the year. There are births and grieving or mourning periods where we support our families and community so that they can focus on what they need to focus on at the time. If they have a new family, they need to focus on, their new babies, or they need to focus on healing, or they need to focus on grieving altogether and following processes and protocols so that they can grieve in a healthy way. But also, elders, I'm thinking about elder care, ceremony, all of the different ways that I'll be able to participate in community by by having a healthy gathering practice. So I'm not the only one. That's a gathering mentality. Whereas a forager is often very extractive. You're going right up to, somebody else's home and you're gathering from common areas that subsistence gatherers are have tended into existence and are still gathering from. So uh, it it tends to harm our generational subsistence gatherers the most, and those are usually elders. Um, Commercial foraging dollars do not stay in our community. They come up and gather, and then they bring them back down to the Bay Area. There's no relationship or kinship with our communities, and that money does not stay in our economies up there. And I hear this a lot from foragers where they will come up and be really excited for mushroom season. And I talked to one person who was a mycologist in the Bay Area, and he had been up there and gathered thousands of pounds of mushrooms. He was really excited to tell me. But when I asked him if he knew anybody, if he knew any Cutter people or Klamath people or any people, he had not met a single Native person in 30 years of and thousands of pounds of mushrooms. So that for me is a missed opportunity for somebody who has this level of expertise that he has to teach our children, to help out our subsistence gatherers, to help, resupply some knowledge back into our communities. And I'm not, and it, I think it's just because it isn't necessarily the mentality that hasn't been cultivated. So, um, but I do see how an easy shift can be made to become a gatherer. And oftentimes it may mean that there isn't, that you have to delay your own gratification, or you have to delay something in order to do it in a good way, or call ahead and see if there's any places that are off limits. What if we're in a restoration mode and we don't, and disturbance is not needed in that area? Or, just calling ahead and finding out if there are any places that are off limits, or places that might need some disturbance, or places to go and spread spores around if needed. You know, just being in community, it changes the nature of your relationship to the place that you're gathering in a deeper, more meaningful way. And that's what I really hope for everybody who's connecting culturally, is that they'll do it through the lens of kinship and hospitality as a guest in this land, and how to, like, really, to stop feeling like a guest on the land is to be in family, like be in a family way with us. So next slide. Oh, I didn't know if anybody wanted to watch a video, but thought that this would be a good time because I need to blow my nose. I need to get a drink of water. So I'm like, I could feel it coming on. So if you don't mind, you can watch this video, and I'm gonna turn my camera off for a second and my mic, and I'll come back as soon as it's over. It's just a
Okay,
couple minutes. It's like two
perfect. Yeah.
minutes. Okay,
All
thank
right.
you.
Yeah, no problem. Oop. Okay, I'm going to restart this. It looks like um, I am not sharing my sound. So give me just a moment to figure this out.
While you're doing that, Steve and Lisa, this is just a reminder to everyone that if you have a question that you'd like to ask Sarah, go ahead and put that in the chat, or excuse me, the Q&A section. If you want something that you want her to address or talk about, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A, and it's being monitored. So at the end of her presentation, we will pose her the questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maddie. And now, hopefully, I have figured
can go to the next slide. And you can go to the next slide, yeah. Or just skip it to the next slide. There you go. Okay, so this is my recap here, and that like native recipes are recipes by native people, and that it's important to me that we meet people where they're at in their journey, and that we can't all decolonize all at once, and that we are where we are. We didn't invent these systems, we didn't develop them, and they weren't the ones that we would have chosen for ourselves, but we are where we're at. And they don't have to be 100% traditional to have a deep cultural value. So, for example, I'm making an acorn pancake, but I can still talk to my children about our gathering time, the time that we spent gathering these acorns, and it's still an opportunity for storytelling, an opportunity for us to make art and all of the other things, and practice our language, all the things that come with uh, cultural connection to your foodways. They don't have to be 100% traditional to be healthy. And making small changes leads to healthier outcomes. We know that it's much more successful when we change our diets with intention in a smaller way. And that incorporating our traditional foods into these diets does give us a better understanding of our relationships to the land, and helps our reconnection to each other and community, and to just like the cultural life ways. It's a snowball. Once you start, it all starts with food. So um that's how it always has started with me, is with food, and that's my touchstone that I go back to when I start to feel that I need to um, listen more, and I go right to those original relatives, the real, original elders that I answer to more than anybody in this world. That's who I answer to. So I think as people are reconnecting to their own cultural life ways and what it is to be, diverse, racially diverse, culturally diverse, it's going intentionally and slowly, and centering tradition, like centering Indigenous people whose land you're on, and centering being in community with them will bring you to the place that you're looking for, as far as your connection to something like larger and closer to your original cultural values and life ways. So yeah, that's that. Next slide, and I'm finished. So I want to see if there's any question.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so wonderful and informative, and engaging. And I am going to go ahead and stop my screen share. And
Okay.
then I'm also going to stop the recording, so we won't record the question portion of the presentation. So give me just a quick moment to figure out how to do